Hi, I'm Walter D. Kennedy, Chief of Heritage Operations for the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and I'm here with Ron Kennedy, the Deputy Chief of Heritage Promotions for the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And this is part two of our study of the Constitution. As we said in part one, September is a month that we set aside to really look at, study, and admire the Constitution of the United States as it was originally written. Commander-in-Chief Paul Grambling has declared that September will be the month which all the members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans will take a special look at the Constitution. Now, in this part two, we're going to look at the purpose of the Constitution. And Ron, why do we have a Constitution?
Well, first of all, we need to make sure that everyone understands that the Constitution is not a list of the people's rights.
It's not a cookbook of rights. We don't go to the Constitution and say you have a right to marry here.
No,
Okay.
it's not.
What does it say? You have a right to secede.
That's not part of the Constitution. That
Okay.
belongs to the states,
Okay.
the sovereign states. The Constitution really is a procedure manual for the federal government. So think about it like a procedure manual. This is how the federal government is to act. Now, historian and constitutional scholar Dr. Forrest McDonald said this. He declared, number one, he said, "I share Jefferson's belief that it is the right of all branches of the federal government and of the states as well, and not just the Supreme Court, to guard the Constitution against encroachments." Now, this is a very important, and he went on to say, the commands and prohibitions of the Constitution apply not to private individuals, not to the citizen, not to the people, but to government. It is, in other words, law that government follows.
So the Constitution is really set there to, number one, give us a structure of our government and a specific limitation, or a limitation of that government. It tells the government what it can and cannot do.
Exactly. And Forrest McDonald wasn't the only scholar.
Well,
there's
who
a
else?
number of scholars,
Yeah.
of course, going back all the way to the very beginning of the United States, but we're speaking now more of contemporary,
Yeah.
current. Dr. Mel Bradford said, quote, "The Constitution was designed to bring government under the rule of law as opposed to achieving any specific purpose." Now, that achieving any specific purpose, what do you think Mel meant by that?
I would think that he means the government is not here to provide all the goodies that you may want.
Exactly. Government, as created by the Founding Fathers, the federal government was not created to bring about, say, equality of outcome, or redistribution of income, or universal health care, or any other social engineering project. Government, that was not the function of the federal government. And it's important, when you look at the Constitution, you'll see that 20% of the Constitution, as ratified by the founders, 20% of it was specifications of things that the federal government could not do. 11% of the Constitution, it's concerned with positive grants of power to the federal government. But the really interesting thing, as we talked about in part one, these same powers, most of them already existed. The federal government already had it under the Articles of Confederation.
So it wasn't new powers.
Wasn't a whole lot of new powers. Again, the main thing was the fact that of free trade zone between the states. Over 66% of the Constitution addresses the task of making government act in accordance to law.
But, it's interesting you talk about the grants of power. The very first words of the Constitution states that Congress is granted authority. Now, if I am granted authority, I know that a higher power is giving me something. A peasant doesn't grant the Lord anything.
No,
it's the other way around. So the very first words of the Constitution lets us know we've got a limited government here, and there's a higher power out there, and of course that's the people of the states. Why else? Why do we have a Constitution now?
Well, the Constitution is set up to guarantee that the sovereign states, their powers, their reserved rights will be protected. Now, the Constitution also addressed a few things belonging to the states, because it says in Article 1, Section 10, it contains specific things that the sovereign states agreed to renounce or say, we will no longer, as sovereign states, exercise these powers.
So wait a minute now, you're telling me they did have these powers, but now they're granting them to another source.
Right. And well, really what they're saying is, yes, the federal government can do these things if the Constitution says they can,
Okay.
but we will no longer do it because the states were sovereign. And as we said, a state was the same as a nation. So the states were sovereign. Here's some of the things. They make treaties. So states aren't going to go out. The state of Virginia is not going to go to France and make a treaty with France. Now, during the Revolutionary War,
They did.
They did.
Right.
But no longer, because we're not going to, that sovereign power we're going to yield in favor of the federal government. Coin money, pass ex post facto laws, grant letters of marque. They can't send guys out as privateers, that type of thing. So these were, but that's the main thing that limited the states, and the states did that to themselves. They said, look, we'll let the federal government do this. We won't do
I
it.
think that's where the Constitution says no state shall.
Right.
And so if you want to know what a state cannot do, go to the Constitution and read it. It's plain. It's right there.
It's right there. Now, of all the checks and balances designed by the Founding Fathers, and you see, especially talking heads on TV, the modern day conservatives,
Neoconservatives, what I
neocons,
call
or even just talking heads, conservative, they love to brag about division of power, separation of powers, checks and balance, and which is good, legislative, executive, judicial.
Right.
But that's not the primary way that the Founding Fathers set up to harness the dangers of the federal government, of a central government. It was the sovereign states. The states' rights was to be used as the primary check to an abusive federal government.
Well, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here because you said that, but yet our opponents tell us, but the Constitution tells us that the federal government will be supreme law of the land.
That's the Supremacy Clause,
Right.
which John C. Calhoun pointed out was the most important clause to validate state sovereignty.
Now, how can that be if it's saying that the federal government is supreme in all areas?
Well, that's because those people, as General Lee would call the Yankees, those people tend to stop at that point and read no further. That's like reading scripture and stopping and not reading the rest of it. It says, all acts of this government that's done and passed in pursuant of the Constitution.
So what is that phrase, in pursuant
That
of?
means
What does that mean?
if it doesn't conflict, if it doesn't do something in order for the federal government to do something, it must have an explicit acknowledgement in the Constitution that it has the right to do it. So
It's that grant of
that
power.
grant of
the
power.
first
If it's not
words.
in pursuant to that, then it's not the
And I
supreme
believe-
law,
I
and
believe-
it's null and void.
And I believe Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist paper even mentioned that anything that is done that is not pursuant to the Constitution is null.
Null and void and to be ignored.
Right, exactly. It's interesting. Well, did the Constitution create states' rights? We hear all this time, oh, hey, you Southerners, you're fighting for states' rights. And we often say, well, we fight for states' rights. What did the Constitution, is that where we get states' rights?
No.
Oh,
No,
okay.
absolutely
Well, that's
not.
a quick answer. Let's have a little more
No,
information.
it's not, and you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking at a chicken house for your cows. I mean, it's just you're looking in the wrong place, fella. Look somewhere else. States' rights arises from the fact that the states are sovereign. Original sovereignty remains with the state. The sovereign states existed prior to the federal government. Now, up to 1860, this was a commonly accepted
It was a
thing.
given.
I think every president up to 1860 agreed with that.
Abraham Lincoln was 16th president, I believe, There were 15 presidents before him, and every one of those presidents admitted that the states were sovereign and the states created the federal government, i.e. the Union, but Mr. Lincoln came along and turned that upside down.
With the power of bloody bayonets, you can do a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, in 1798, when the High Federalists, they had the president, John Adams, they had control of Congress,
Right.
and they had control of, and they've always had control, seemingly, of the Supreme Court. But they passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which specifically violated free speech and free press. And the states, the majority of the states, merely nullified that law.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the Alien Sedition Act. If I remember correctly, even a congressman in the
Yes.
U.S. Congress was tried by the United
Yes.
States Supreme Court and sent to prison.
For violating the Alien and Sedition Act.
And so,
And newspapers were closed down. It was a terrible time. But the thing that were able to protect the people wasn't the Supreme Court, because it was
Obviously.
part and parcel of the problem.
Because-
It was the sovereign state that protected its citizens.
did not Jefferson and Madison write some resolves that address that issue?
Absolutely. In 1798, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison made it clear that it was the sovereign state that had the authority, and not the federal Supreme Court, not federal Congress, not the federal president, but it was the sovereign state that had the final and ultimate authority to judge whether or not the federal government was violating the Constitution, whether or not it was acting in pursuant of the Constitution. Now, for those that want to see, look up you can Google this
Yeah,
now. Look up the Virginia and Kentucky resolves of 1798, and you'll see this is where nullification was specifically talked about, the possibility that the state had the right. Now, in addition, that the state was superior to the Constitution was except for, like Section 10, Article 1 that we talked about, where the U.S. Supreme Court in 1833, Barron versus Baltimore, the Supreme Court confirmed that the Bill of Rights, that first 10 amendments to the Constitution, did not apply to the states.
Or the people thereof.
Exactly. So, and for that is probably one of the greatest examples of state sovereignty right there.
I'll be doggone. So what happened to this limited form of federalism and real states' rights that we had? Founding Fathers gave us. It was here until the election of Mr. Lincoln. Did it get lost? Did America change? Did we have a constitutional amendment to get rid of states' rights? What happened?
Well, recall that in Section 1 of this series, we talked about how there was two ways to change the Constitution: the constitutional way through amendment,
The legal way.
or the unconstitutional way. And
The
you
legal
can
way.
wage war against one party and compel them and coerce them to accept a new Constitution. It would be in violation of the Declaration of Independence, where it said that we have the right to a government based upon the consent of the governed.
Not compulsion.
Not
Consent.
compulsion and not bloody bayonets. But that's what happened after 1860. Now, President Woodrow Wilson, who was a progressive, who really was celebrating this fact, in 1908 wrote a book, The Constitution of the United States, and he declared, the war between the states, or as we would say,
The war for
the
Southern
war for
independence.
Southern independence. But he said, quote, the war between the states established this principle, that the federal government is, through its courts, the final judge of its own powers. Now, what dictator could ask for a better recipe?
Absolutely. Adolf Hitler wanted to be the final judge of his power.
And he was. So was Stalin. So was Mayo.
They all. So that runs in the face of, slaps the Founding Fathers directly in the face. So, the Constitution and states' rights are necessary to protect individual liberty. How do we get back to that situation?
Well, we have to realize that no word, no article, no phrase in the Constitution is self-enforcing. The Constitution, without the means to enforce its limitations upon the federal government, is nothing but, as Jefferson said, a parchment barricade.
A paper barricade.
Paper barricade. So the Constitution cannot be a protector of our liberties and freedoms without some means to enforce it. In the Constitution of a limited republic of sovereign states, as established by the Founding Fathers, we, the people of the sovereign states, are the final judge. Think about this. Today, the federal government judges whether or not it's abiding by the rules of the game, the Constitution. What would happen in a football game if the team on offense got to decide whether or not it was playing according to the rules? Not exactly a fair game, and that's what we have today.
Well, that's great. We are really coming to the end of part 2, and I think that this gives us some idea that the Constitution we have today, we live under today, is quite different than what our Founding Fathers gave us. And this is why you and I and most people in the Sons of Confederate Veterans have always said that the South was right in 1861 because America was right in 1776. Our Confederate forefathers were defending the real Constitution given to us by our Founding Fathers. I hope this quick look into the United States Constitution and the month of September will be a good month for everyone to celebrate, to study, and to learn more about that wonderful document, the Constitution of the United States.